Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. After 11 years of marriage and discovering what my wife really thought of me, vanishing seemed like the only rational response. My name is Ray, and this is the story of how the woman I'd been trying to save our marriage with had been planning my financial destruction for years. The thing about long marriages is that you start making excuses for behaviors that would alarm you in any other relationship. When Francesca started rolling her eyes more often, I told myself that's what happens after you've been together since your early 20s. When she stopped laughing at my jokes, I figured she'd just heard them too many times. When our conversations dwindled to logistics about bills and household chores, I assumed that was normal married life. We'd met when I was 24, working my way up in insurance claims investigation, and she was 22, managing a small clothing boutique. Francesca was funny, flirtatious, and had strong opinions about everything when we connected. I was immediately attracted to her confidence and the way she could make mundane situations feel interesting. We got married the next year after dating for 8 months. Looking back, maybe that was too fast, but we were young and optimistic. The first few years were genuinely good. We rented a small apartment downtown, shared cooking duties, and spent weekends doing fun things and visiting family. We had our good days and talked constantly about our plans for the future. The problem started about 4 years into the marriage when we began trying to have children. Francesca got pregnant 3 different times, and each pregnancy ended in heartbreak. 2 early miscarriages that were devastating enough, but the stillbirth that came afterwards nearly destroyed both of us. We'd made it to 7 months, had the nursery ready, chosen names, and told both our families. Coming home to that empty room changed something fundamental in our relationship. Francesca withdrew emotionally after each loss, and I didn't know how to help her. We tried counseling briefly, but she refused to continue after a few sessions. I suggested adoption, but she wasn't ready to consider it. The topic of children became off-limits, and with it went a lot of our shared dreams about the future. We wanted to try again, but the 3rd miscarriage seemed to close some doors in Francesca permanently. She threw herself into work, taking on extra shifts and responsibilities at the department store. I had no option but to focus on my career too, eventually working mostly from home. We were successful professionally, but increasingly like strangers personally. After about 8 years of being married, our conversations had become purely functional. Francesca would come home tired from work and immediately disappear into the bedroom with her phone. I'd make dinner, eat alone while watching TV, and we'd go to bed at different times. The few times I tried to initiate physical intimacy, she'd claim exhaustion or stress. I told myself that grief affected people differently, that long marriages went through phases. What I didn't realize was that Francesca had already checked out of our marriage emotionally and was actively planning her exit strategy. While I was making excuses for her coldness and criticizing myself for not being a better husband, she was building a completely separate life that didn't include me. The changes in Francesca were gradual enough that I convinced myself they were normal. She started caring more about her appearance again, which I initially took as a positive sign. She bought new clothes, started going to the gym regularly, and began wearing makeup to work every day. When I complimented her and tried to talk to her about the change, she'd just shrug or say something about wanting to look professional. She also became increasingly critical of our living situation. We'd been leasing the same 3-bedroom townhouse, and it was perfectly adequate for 2 people. But Francesca started making comments about how embarrassing it was that we didn't own our own home, how small the kitchen was, and how outdated the appliances were. She'd point out houses for sale online and make passive-aggressive comments about couples our age who had real homes. Our social life disappeared entirely. Francesca became increasingly reluctant to socialize as a couple. She'd claim to be tired or say she didn't feel like being around people, or find some other excuse to avoid group activities. I started declining invitations rather than go places alone or deal with Francesca's mood about it. The intimacy in our marriage had been declining since the pregnancy losses, but from our 7th year, we were essentially living like polite roommates. We hadn't been intimate in a long time, barely touched each other in passing, and slept on opposite sides of our king-size bed. I tried several times to initiate romantic gestures, planning special dinners, suggesting weekend getaways, or simply trying to have meaningful conversations about our relationship. Francesca's responses to these attempts ranged from indifferent to annoyed. She'd eat the special dinners while scrolling through her phone, declined the weekend trips due to work obligations, and shut down relationship conversations by saying she was too tired to deal with heavy discussions. I began to wonder if we'd simply grown apart naturally, or if there was something fundamentally wrong with me as a husband. The phone issue was something I'd noticed, but hadn't really processed consciously. Francesca had always been somewhat protective of her phone, but it had become almost comical. She'd carry it with her to the bathroom, charge it on her side of the bed, and immediately grab it whenever it buzzed. If I were nearby when she was texting, she'd angle the screen away from me or wait until I left the room to respond to messages. When I'd ask casually who she was texting, she'd give vague answers about work colleagues or her sister. If I pressed for details about her day or mentioned that she seemed to be getting a lot of messages, she'd become defensive and accuse me of being suspicious. I'd back off because the last thing I wanted was to become the kind of husband who monitored his wife's communications. Francesca's work schedule gradually changed. She was staying late 3 or 4 nights per week. She always had some excuse. Either she was covering for someone who'd called in sick or handling some emergency with a difficult customer. She'd mention running into friends or claim traffic was terrible. There's always something. One Saturday morning, Francesca was planning to run errands. She got ready with her usual routine: shower at 9:30, coffee and toast by 10:15. She seemed more excited than usual about going out, checking her appearance multiple times in the hallway mirror, and changing her outfit twice. As she was grabbing her keys and purse around 10:30, she mentioned she might stop at a few other places and would be back in a couple of hours. It wasn't until about 11:30 a.m., when I was taking a break between responding to emails, that I noticed her phone on the side of her bed. This was really unusual for Francesca. My first thought was to drive it to her, but I had no idea which store she was planning to visit or what order she'd go in. I decided to just wait until she got home and went back to my work emails. By around 12:30, my curiosity was getting the better of me. I picked up the phone and saw that it was locked with a 4-digit passcode. I knew I probably shouldn't try to unlock it, but I tried to remember if I'd ever seen Francesca enter her passcode, and I vaguely recalled her using numbers that might be related to our anniversary. I tried the first pin on my mind, but that wasn't our exact wedding date. The screen shook and said incorrect passcode. I tried our actual wedding date. Again, incorrect. I almost gave up, but then tried the date reversed. The phone unlocked immediately. I combed through the phone, not looking for anything in particular. But I stumbled on something that left me shocked. My hands were literally shaking as I opened the Tinder app. I'd heard of it, obviously, but had never used it or seen it in action. What I found was a complete dating profile for my wife, with photos I'd never seen her take. In these pictures, Francesca looked younger, more confident, more alive than she'd appeared at home in a while. Her bio described her as recently separated and looking for genuine connections with mature men who know what they want. The profile showed that she'd been active as recently as that morning, with multiple matches and ongoing conversations. I scrolled through message after message with different men, each conversation more intimate and flirtatious than anything Francesca and I had shared in years. She was witty, engaging, and sexually provocative in these messages. Everything she hadn't been with me for as long as I could remember. One conversation stood out because of its frequency and depth. A man whose profile indicated he was a 41-year-old divorcee had been messaging Francesca almost daily for what appeared to be several months. Their conversation history and the tone had evolved from casual flirtation to something much more serious and intimate. Reading through their messages with Francesca felt like discovering a completely different person. She shared details about her day, her thoughts about work, her opinions about movies and music, all the casual intimacy that had disappeared from our marriage years ago. But more disturbing were the messages where she complained about me. The guy would ask about her situation at home, and Francesca would respond with detailed criticisms of everything. She described me as boring, lazy, and completely oblivious to what I need. She made jokes about my attempts at romance, calling them pathetic and embarrassing. She shared intimate details about our dead bedroom, describing me as selfish and clueless about her needs. The most painful messages were the ones where Francesca expressed her feelings about our marriage directly. In one exchange from 2 weeks earlier, her new lover had asked why she didn't just file for divorce. Her response was, "I literally can't stand him anymore and wish I could just disappear, but I need to wait a bit longer for the financial benefits." My sister's lawyer told me that 12 to 15 years is the sweet spot for lifetime alimony eligibility. She continued, "I know it sounds calculating, but I need to protect myself financially. He makes decent money, and I've sacrificed everything for this marriage. I can't just walk away with nothing after all these years of putting up with his inadequacies." Her lover's response was encouraging and supportive. "You deserve so much better than what you're getting. I can't wait until you're free from that situation and we can be together properly." This exchange showed me that they had been meeting in person regularly. They'd been having an affair for months, with Francesca using her work emergencies and extended errands as cover for their meetings. The messages included references to hotels, restaurants, and specific dates that matched times Francesca had claimed to be working late or running errands. What really got to me was how happy and engaged Francesca seemed in these messages. This was the woman I'd fallen in love with more than a decade ago. She was still capable of being that person, just not with me. She hadn't changed or become depressed. She'd simply decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. I spent over an hour reading through months of messages, taking screenshots of the most damning evidence. The affair was clearly documented, but more importantly for legal purposes, Francesca's own words revealed her strategy of staying in the marriage solely for financial gain, while actively despising me and planning her exit. By the time I'd finished reading through the messages, I felt completely numb. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated deception that had been going on for months, while I'd been desperately trying to save our marriage. Every romantic gesture I'd attempted, every conversation about our problems, every effort to reconnect had been met with secret ridicule and contempt. I carefully returned Francesca's phone to exactly where she'd left it and tried to continue with my workday. But I couldn't concentrate when my entire marriage had just been revealed as an elaborate fraud. I kept thinking about all the signs I'd missed, all the excuses I'd made for Francesca's behavior, all the times I'd blamed myself for our problems. That afternoon, I called my brother Paul and asked if I could come. I didn't explain why, but something in my voice must have conveyed the urgency, because he immediately said yes. Paul and I had always been close, and he was one of the few people who'd occasionally mentioned that Francesca seemed different in recent years. When I arrived at Paul's house that evening, I told him everything I'd discovered. He listened without interruption as I described the dating profile, the messages with a new guy, and Francesca's strategy of staying married for financial benefits. Paul's reaction was immediate and decisive. I needed to contact a divorce attorney immediately and document everything I'd found. Paul recommended a family law attorney who'd handled his friend's complicated divorce the previous year. I called the attorney's office first thing the next day and explained my situation. He agreed to meet with me that afternoon and advised me to bring all the evidence I'd gathered. Their office was in a downtown high-rise, and meeting with him made the situation feel suddenly real and official. He reviewed the screenshots methodically, asking questions about our marriage, our assets, and our financial situation. The evidence of adultery was clear and well documented, which would significantly impact any alimony claims Francesca might make. The attorney explained that in our state, adultery was grounds for divorce and could affect spousal support decisions. Francesca's own words about staying in the marriage solely for financial gain would also work against her in court. He advised me to continue documenting any suspicious behavior while he prepared divorce papers and developed our legal strategy. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived in a strange state of suspended reality. Francesca continued her double life, apparently unaware that I knew about her new guy and her plans to leave me for alimony. She maintained her routine of late work nights and weekend errands, presumably meeting with her new guy and possibly other men from her dating apps. During this period, I started making practical preparations for the end of our marriage. Since we were renting our house and had no children, dividing our lives would be relatively straightforward. I opened a separate bank account and began quietly transferring my direct deposits there. I researched apartments and looked into storage facilities for my belongings. I also started gradually removing important items from our house to a storage unit I rented. Nothing obvious, just things that belonged to me personally. Francesca was so absorbed in her affair and work that she didn't notice anything missing. By the end of the second week, the lawyer had prepared all the necessary divorce paperwork. The documents outlined irreconcilable differences as grounds for divorce, but included all the evidence of Francesca's adultery and her documented plans to stay in the marriage for financial gain. He advised me that serving Francesca with papers at her workplace might be the cleanest approach, but I had a different idea. I wanted to control the timing and manner of revealing what I knew. Francesca had been deceiving me for months, treating me with contempt. I saw no reason to give her the courtesy of advance warning or the opportunity to prepare her own narrative about our marriage's end. A day after I got the papers, Francesca left for work at her usual time. As soon as Francesca's car was out of sight, I called in sick to work and began the final phase of my plan. I had already moved most of my important belongings to storage, so what remained was primarily furniture and household items that could be replaced. I packed a suitcase with clothes and personal items, loaded it into my car with a few remaining valuables, and prepared to leave. The signed divorce papers went on the kitchen table. I placed my house key next to the papers and wrote a brief note. I know about everything. I know about your plans to stay married for alimony. I'm done pretending to be married to you. Contact my attorney if you need anything. I managed to rent a furnished apartment across town, and everything I truly needed was either in my car or waiting for me in storage. Francesca called me at 9:23 p.m. I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately, then again. By 11 p.m., I had 12 missed calls and several increasingly frantic voicemails. The first message was confusing. Ray, what is this? Call me back immediately. The second was anger. You can't just disappear like this. We need to talk about this like adults. The third was desperation. Please just call me back. I didn't respond to any of her calls or messages. There was nothing to explain or discuss. Francesca had made her feelings about me and our marriage crystal clear in her messages to her new man. She could work out the logistics of our divorce through her attorney. Francesca hired a divorce attorney with a reputation for aggressive representation of wives in divorces. As the divorce progressed, Sandra filed motions requesting spousal support, half of our savings accounts, half of my retirement funds, and various other claims designed to maximize Francesca's financial settlement. My attorney handled most of the court proceedings, with me appearing only when absolutely required. During these appearances, Francesca would stare at me from across the courtroom with anger. The evidence my attorney presented was overwhelming and well organized. Francesca's own words, documented in her messages with her new guy, showed clear evidence of adultery and her calculated plan to stay married solely for financial gain. Her credibility was completely destroyed when her lawyer tried to claim that Francesca had been a devoted wife who'd sacrificed her career for our marriage. The judge was particularly unimpressed with Francesca's request for lifetime alimony, given her documented affairs and her own statements about staying in the marriage for financial benefit. In the end, Francesca got a considerable settlement. Francesca was bitter about the settlement, apparently having expected much more. According to mutual friends, she blamed me for being vindictive and cruel in the divorce proceedings. She couldn't seem to understand that her own documented behavior had determined the outcome, not any vindictiveness on my part. The divorce was finalized almost exactly 1 year after I discovered Francesca's double life. The contrast between my last years with Francesca and my current life was striking. Looking back on those 11 years of marriage, I can see now that Francesca and I were probably incompatible from early on, but the pregnancy losses had accelerated our problems and given us both excuses to avoid addressing them. Instead of working together through our grief, we'd grown apart and blamed each other for our distance. What I still find difficult to forgive is not the affair itself, but the deliberate deception about her motivations. If Francesca had wanted to leave the marriage, she could have done so honestly. If she'd fallen out of love with me, that would have been painful, but understandable. But choosing to stay married solely to maximize her financial gain while actively despising me was a level of calculating cruelty I hadn't expected from someone I'd loved for so long. The phone discovery was the wake-up call I needed to see that I'd been living in denial about the state of our marriage. Francesca's behavior toward me had been telling the story for months, but I've been making excuses and blaming myself rather than accepting that she'd simply decided I wasn't worth her effort anymore. The way I left might seem dramatic, but it felt like the most honest response to a situation built on dishonesty. Francesca had been living a double life for months, and I saw no reason to give her the opportunity to manipulate the narrative about our divorce or try to negotiate her way out of the consequences of her choices. A year later, I'm genuinely grateful that Francesca forgot her phone that morning. Without that accidental discovery, I might have spent several more years as an unwitting participant in her financial strategy, believing I was working to save a marriage while she was actively planning my destruction. Sometimes the most painful truth is also the most liberating.